I never should have taken the shortcut. I knew the woods were vast, that they swallowed people whole if they weren't careful. But I thought I knew them. I had grown up on the edges of these trees, had run through them as a child, had listened to my grandfather's stories about the things that lurked within. But I didn't listen when he warned me. I thought they were just stories. It started last Friday. I was driving back from my cousin Tyler's place, a few miles out from town. We'd been watching old horror movies, the kind with cheap special effects and too much screaming. And by the time I left, the moon was high, cold, and distant. The highway would have taken me another 20 minutes out of my way, so I took the back roads. Then, stupidly, I decided to cut through the old logging trails. I had done it a few times before, and it had always shaved off a good chunk of time. But that was in the daylight. At night, those woods felt different. The dirt path was uneven, littered with fallen branches, and my headlights barely cut through the darkness. The trees loomed tall, ancient, pressing in like silent watchers. The deeper I went, the more the road seemed unfamiliar. The trees all looked the same, gnarled and black, their twisted limbs reaching for my truck like skeletal fingers. Then I saw something in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, a shape standing still in my high beams just beyond the bend. But as I got closer, my stomach twisted. It was a person. They were standing in the middle of the path, facing away from me, motionless. Their clothes were torn, hanging off their frame in ragged strips. Their hair was matted, long, tangled down their back. Their feet were bare, planted firmly in the dirt. I slowed the truck, hesitating. My first thought was that someone was hurt, maybe lost. But something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every instinct told me not to get out. I honked the horn lightly. The figure didn't move. I tried again. Nothing. A slow, creeping fear started crawling up my spine. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal this deep in the woods. I weighed my options. Either I backed out the way I came, which would take a while, or I drove forward, passing the figure and hoping they didn't suddenly lunge at my truck. I decided on the latter. I eased my foot onto the gas, steering around them, keeping my eyes locked on their back as I passed. The closer I got, the worse the feeling in my gut became. My headlights illuminated them in harsh detail. Their skin was unnaturally pale, stretched too tightly over their bones. Their arms hung limply at their sides, fingers long and stiff. As my truck edged past them, they moved. Not a step. Not a flinch. They twisted. Their entire upper body turned toward me while their legs stayed rooted in place. Their head cocked sharply, eyes locking onto mine, and their face, it wasn't right. Their eyes were too dark, like hollow pits. Their mouth was wrong, lips pulled too far back as if they had forgotten how to smile. I slammed my foot on the gas. My tires kicked up dirt as I sped forward, my heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't look back. I didn't check my mirrors. I just drove, tearing through the winding trail, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road stretched endlessly, longer than I remembered. It felt like I was driving in circles. The trees blurred past me, shadows flickering in my peripherals. I kept glancing at my fuel gauge, watching the needle dip lower and lower. Then I heard it. A sound. Not from behind me. Not from the sides. From above. A scratching, scraping noise, like nails dragging across metal. I held my breath. My fingers tightened around the wheel. Something thumped against the roof of my truck. I swerved instinctively, nearly losing control. My tires skidded over loose gravel, but I managed to correct the wheel. The thumping came again, heavier this time. Something was on top of my truck. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced through every possibility, some wild animal, a fallen branch, but deep down I knew. I didn't dare look up. I just drove. The road twisted ahead, and I spotted a break in the trees, a clearing. If I could just make it there, maybe I could shake whatever this was. I pressed the gas harder. The truck roared forward. The weight shifted above me. Then suddenly, a face slammed against my windshield. I screamed. It was them. That same figure, but impossibly fast, impossibly strong. Their hands splayed across the glass, fingers bending at unnatural angles. Their face pressed against the windshield, grinning too wide, eyes black and hollow. I yanked the wheel to the side. The truck skidded violently. My tires slipped on the dirt, and before I could regain control, everything flipped. A deafening crash, glass shattering, metal crumpling, the world spinning, then darkness. I woke to silence. My head throbbed. My body ached all over, my ribs tight and burning with every breath. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the memories hit me like a hammer. The road, the figure, the crash. I was hanging upside down. The seatbelt dug into my chest, keeping me suspended above the shattered windshield. The truck had flipped onto its roof, my belongings scattered across the interior. My phone was nowhere in sight. Outside, the forest was eerily quiet. No wind, no insects, just the distant creak of branches. I struggled to unbuckle my seatbelt, every movement sending a fresh wave of pain through my body. After a few agonizing seconds, the buckle released, and I dropped onto the fractured glass below me. Pain flared through my arm as I landed, but I bit down on it. I had to move. I had to get out. I turned toward the driver's side window, or what was left of it. The glass was broken. The frame twisted from the impact. I started crawling through the opening, ignoring the sharp edges pressing into my palms. Then I heard it. A soft shuffle, somewhere behind me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to move faster, pulling myself through the gap, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I dragged myself free, my vision swam, my head still reeling from the crash. I barely managed to stumble to my feet before I turned to look. My stomach dropped. The figure was standing next to my overturned truck. Closer now. Too close. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its dark, hollow eyes locked onto mine. The way it stood, rigid, its limbs too long, its fingers twitching, it wasn't human. It only wore the shape of one. My breath came fast and uneven. My legs felt weak, but I forced them to move. I took a shaky step backward. It mirrored me. I took another step. It did the same. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. The trees blurred around me as I sprinted blindly through the forest, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound of movement followed. Not footsteps, something faster, something that moved in bursts, closing the distance with unnatural speed. I kept running. My body screamed in protest, every muscle aching, every breath sharp and ragged, but I couldn't stop. Then, up ahead, I saw something. A cabin. Small, old, barely standing, but real. A chance. I threw myself toward it, ignoring the searing pain in my side. The door was slightly ajar, hanging loose on its rusted hinges. I didn't care. I shoved my way inside, slamming it shut behind me, locking it with trembling fingers. The silence that followed was suffocating. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the gaps in the wooden walls. Dust hung thick in the air, and the place smelled of damp wood and rot. For a moment, I thought I had lost it. Then, a whisper, low, drawn out. You shouldn't have come here. My blood ran cold. The voice was wrong, warped, like someone speaking through a broken radio. Slowly, I turned my head. There, in the dim light, standing in the farthest corner of the cabin, was me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It looked just like me. Same clothes, same face, but its eyes were empty, black pits that swallowed the light. It grinned, too wide, its lips stretching, cracking at the corners. It took a step forward, and another. I backed away, my body shaking. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It tilted its head, watching me, studying me. Then, in a voice that mimicked mine perfectly, it whispered, "You don't belong here." And the door behind me burst open. The door slammed open with such force that I was nearly thrown forward. A gust of cold air rushed into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something rancid, like rotting meat. I barely had time to react before I heard it. The sound of something stepping inside. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The thing that had been chasing me, the figure from the road, the one that had been on my truck, it was standing in the doorway now, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. But that wasn't the worst part. Behind me, the other me was still there. I was trapped between them. My stomach twisted violently. My mind raced through impossible thoughts. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet both figures were standing there, breathing in unison, their dark, expressionless faces watching me. Then they spoke. At the same time. "We've been waiting for you." Their voices weren't quite right. They layered over each other, one slightly ahead of the other, warping and twisting in my ears. I staggered backward, my legs trembling beneath me. "No," I whispered. "No, this isn't happening." The thing in the doorway took a step inside. The thing behind me took a step closer. I felt my entire body lock up, Every survival instinct screamed at me to move, to fight, to do something. But I couldn't. My breath came fast, ragged, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would stop. Then, the one in the doorway, the first one, spoke again. Its lips barely moved. "You don't remember, do you?" Something about those words sent a cold dread curling through my veins. I shook my head. "What?" The one behind me answered. This isn't the first time. The room suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "This isn't real." I choked out. "You're not real." The two figures exchanged a glance. Then the one in the doorway grinned, a slow, stretching smile that split its face in a way no human face should ever move. "Then why are you here again?" I opened my mouth to speak, but I couldn't, because something deep inside me stirred. A memory, a fragment of something buried, locked away. I had been here before. I didn't know how or when, but I felt it. A strange, crawling sensation in my brain, like a thought just out of reach. The cabin, the woods, the thing. I had seen this all before. My breath came in short, uneven gasps. I don't... The thing in the doorway lunged. I didn't have time to think. My body reacted before my mind did. I dove to the side, just as it crashed into the floorboards where I had been standing, its two long fingers scraping against the wood. I hit the ground hard, my shoulders screaming in pain, but I scrambled to my feet and bolted. Straight through the open doorway, back into the trees. I could hear them behind me. Both of them. Their movements weren't normal. They didn't run the way people ran. They moved wrong, like puppets with their strings yanked too hard, jerking and twitching unnaturally. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just ran. The forest blurred around me, dark shapes and tangled branches clawing at my skin. The cold night air burned my lungs, but I forced myself forward, faster, harder. Then, up ahead, a light, dim, flickering. A lantern? A house? Something. I pushed myself toward it, my legs screaming in protest, my vision swimming. The trees thinned, and suddenly I was stumbling into a clearing. And there it was, a cabin. My stomach dropped. No, that wasn't possible. I had just left the cabin. I had run in the opposite direction. And yet, it was here. The same cabin. The door hung open, just as I had left it. The air around me felt thick, heavy, as if the entire forest was pressing in on me. My breaths came shallow and frantic. And then, from the doorway, a figure stepped out. I knew who it was before I saw its face. It was me, standing there in the same torn clothes, the same scratches on my arms, the same wild, panicked expression on my face. I shook my head violently, stepping back. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. The other me stared, and then in a voice that was my own, it whispered, "You never left." My breath hitched. I stood frozen, staring at myself, or the thing that wore my face. The night pressed in around me, suffocating, the trees stretching like skeletal hands above. The air smelled damp, heavy with something rancid. My chest ached from running, my legs weak and trembling. But none of that mattered, because I never left. The words rang in my head, sinking into the spaces between my thoughts like a splinter. I shook my head, stepping backward, my hands clenched into fists. No, that's not true. I just ran from here. I turned. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction. No road, no truck, no sign of an exit. Only the cabin. Right where it had always been. I spun back to face the thing on the porch, my pulse hammering against my ribs. It hadn't moved. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow, endless eyes. Then it spoke again. "You keep coming back." I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "That's not possible." The thing in the doorway tilted its head, considering me like an insect under glass. Then, slowly, it raised its hand. A long, gnarled scar ran across its palm. A scar I recognized. I lifted my own hand instinctively, feeling the faint, jagged mark that had been there for years. Something I barely remembered getting. A childhood accident, I thought. Something small. But the thing in the doorway had it too, because it was me. Or maybe I was it. I felt my stomach churn violently, my knees nearly giving out beneath me. My mind screamed that this couldn't be real, that I must have hit my head in the crash, that I must be hallucinating. But deep down, I knew. Something was wrong with time. Something was wrong with me. I had been here before, and I would be here again. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. Its movements were fluid, controlled, unlike the other things that had chased me through the woods. It stopped just at the edge of the porch, standing beneath the dim light flickering above the doorway. Then it whispered, almost kindly, "You should go back inside." The world seemed to tilt. The trees swayed, the night pressing closer, suffocating. My breaths came too fast, too shallow. I couldn't stay here. I had to break the loop. Without another thought, I turned and ran. The forest was endless. No matter how far I ran, how many turns I took, the trees stretched on, the same patterns repeating, the same distant sounds echoing through the branches. My breath came sharp, my legs burning. I forced myself forward, refusing to look back. Then up ahead, a shape, a figure, standing still, waiting. I nearly skidded to a stop. My heart pounded against my ribs as I realized what I was looking at. It was me. Again, standing in the middle of the trail, just like the first one I had seen on the road. Its face was blank, expressionless. Then, slowly, it smiled. Not a normal smile. A wide, inhuman grin that stretched too far, the corners of its lips cracking, splitting. My blood turned to ice. Then it whispered something I couldn't hear. The world lurched. Darkness rushed in, swallowing everything. And then I was standing in the road, right where I had started. My truck idled softly, headlights cutting through the trees. My hands were gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I blinked. The dirt road stretched ahead of me, empty. The trees stood silent, still. No movement, no figure, no chase. I was back at the beginning, like none of it had ever happened. But I knew. I remembered. The scar on my palm throbbed. I lifted my hand slowly, turning it over, staring at the thin, pale line. A deep, twisting unease settled in my stomach. I had been here before, and somehow I knew I would be here again. A whisper drifted through the trees, soft, familiar. "You never left." And then my headlights flickered, and in the rearview mirror, I saw myself smiling,